In this presentation, we focus on the principles of watershed and terrain-sensitive design and examine how topography, hydrology, and land use interact in landscape planning and design processes. The main idea behind this topic is that land should not be designed as if it were a flat and neutral surface. On the contrary, every site is shaped by slope, elevation, surface runoff, drainage pathways, and infiltration processes. These natural systems influence how water moves, where it accumulates, where erosion emerges, and how ecological processes are sustained over time. For this reason, planning and design decisions must respond to the logic of the terrain rather than ignore it. In this lecture, we explore how drainage basins and flow networks define natural spatial boundaries, how terrain-sensitive interventions can reduce flood, erosion, and heat risks, and how tools such as digital elevation models and GIS-based watershed delineation support more evidence-based design decisions. Overall, this topic introduces a way of thinking in which water and landform are treated as structuring forces in resilient landscape planning. The presentation is organized around a clear sequence of concepts, methods, and case studies. First, the learning objectives are introduced to establish the core conceptual relationship between topography, hydrology, and land use. Then, the lecture moves into watershed-based planning, where drainage basins and flow networks are presented as primary natural systems that shape design and planning decisions. This is followed by a section on designing for terrain, which emphasizes how slope, elevation, and runoff dynamics should guide interventions on the ground. After the conceptual framework, the presentation introduces the main analytical tools used in terrain and watershed-sensitive design, including DEMs, watershed delineation in GIS, slope analysis, and flow accumulation mapping. The second half of the lecture focuses on case studies. These include the Shivas Central Climatic Corridor Project, the Desire Project on desertification mitigation and land remediation, and the San Mateo Watershed Master Plan. Finally, the lecture concludes with a summary and reflection section, where the main lessons are brought together to underline how integrated, terrain-responsive planning strengthens ecological resilience and supports risk mitigation across scales. The learning objectives of this lecture can be understood in three complementary parts. First, students are expected to understand the relationship between topography, hydrology, and land use. This means recognizing that landform is not only a visual or physical condition, but also a functional system that controls water flow, erosion patterns, infiltration potential, and ecological continuity. Second, students are expected to learn how to design with slope, flow, and elevation in mind. In other words, planning should respond to the way water moves through the landscape rather than attempt to force standardized solutions onto very different terrain conditions. Third, students should be able to identify terrain-sensitive strategies that reduce flood, erosion, and heat risks. These include contour-aligned development, terracing, riparian buffers, infiltration-supportive interventions, and the avoidance of construction in flood-prone zones and on steep slopes. Altogether, these learning objectives emphasize that resilient planning requires working with environmental processes. Instead of treating runoff, slope, or water retention as secondary technical matters, the lecture frames them as central design parameters that should inform spatial decision-making from the beginning. This slide explains one of the most important foundations of watershed-based planning, the idea that terrain morphology governs both surface runoff and groundwater flow systems. The watershed and sub-watershed boundaries shown in the figure are not arbitrary planning lines, they are natural hydrological boundaries that define how precipitation is collected, routed, infiltrated, or discharged toward an outlet. The digital elevation model in the visual makes this logic easier to understand by showing how differences in elevation and slope determine flow direction and runoff accumulation across the catchment. In addition, the groundwater flow diagrams show that hydrological processes are not limited to visible surface water. Local and regional groundwater movement, infiltration zones, and subsurface recharge also depend on terrain conditions. This matters for design because if we understand how the land naturally organizes water, then landscape interventions can be aligned with those patterns. Such an approach supports infiltration, improves groundwater recharge, regulates runoff, and helps reduce flood and erosion risks. Therefore, watershed-based planning is not simply about drainage management. It is about reading the terrain as a hydrological structure and using that structure to guide safer and more ecologically responsive planning decisions. In this part of the lecture, the watershed is examined through different types of hydrological units. Three key units are identified: the main watershed, sub-watersheds, and direct drainage areas. This distinction is important because not every part of the basin behaves in the same way. Direct drainage areas convey runoff and sediment directly to the main stream corridor or lake body at the basin floor. Their connection to the main receiving water body is therefore more immediate. By contrast, in sub-watersheds, runoff and sediment move first through smaller tributary channels before being integrated into the larger basin-wide drainage network. This means that the hydrological connectivity, sediment transfer patterns, and timing of runoff differ between these units. From a planning perspective, this requires differentiated strategies. A one-size-fits-all intervention is not sufficient because each catchment unit has its own behavior, sensitivity, and management need. Some areas may require erosion control, some may require infiltration enhancement, and others may require careful control of runoff concentration. The core lesson here is that watershed planning becomes more effective when hydrological differences within the basin are recognized and translated into spatially specific planning and design responses. This slide introduces different stream drainage patterns and flow types in order to explain how topography and geology shape hydrological organization. Drainage systems may appear as dendritic, parallel, radial, ring-like, or more complex forms. Each of these patterns reflects the influence of slope conditions, geological structure, and terrain morphology. In practical terms, these patterns determine how rainfall is converted into runoff and how water is conveyed toward natural channels. The second part of the visual explains the transition of runoff from sheet flow to shallow concentrated flow and finally to channel flow as water accumulates downslope. This sequence is particularly important in terrain-sensitive design because erosion risk, infiltration opportunity, and runoff velocity all change across these stages. If designers understand where water remains dispersed and where it becomes concentrated, they can place interventions more strategically. Measures aimed at slowing runoff, increasing infiltration, stabilizing slopes, or preventing erosion must respond to these actual flow conditions. Therefore, the slide shows that hydrological behavior is not random. It follows recognizable spatial patterns, and understanding these patterns allows planners and designers to develop more effective, terrain-responsive, and watershed-based solutions. This slide demonstrates how terrain-sensitive design can be translated into a practical strategy within an urban watershed. The guiding principle is clearly stated: reduce runoff on slopes and accelerate safe flow on the valley floor. This means that upland areas should not send uncontrolled water rapidly downslope, because that increases erosion and flood pressure downstream. Instead, interventions such as contour terracing, swales, infiltration trenches, rain gardens, and permeable soil treatments are used to slow water movement, spread it more evenly, and support infiltration. In steeper areas, check dams and stabilized drainage channels help reduce flow velocity and control erosion. At the same time, controlled outlet structures direct excess runoff toward designated flood conveyance corridors where water can move more safely. The key idea is that different parts of the terrain require different hydrological functions. Hillsides should support retention and infiltration, while valley floors should manage the safe passage of unavoidable excess flow. By aligning the design with natural terrain and hydrological logic, the landscape can regulate stormwater more effectively, reduce peak discharge during rainfall events, and improve groundwater recharge. This contributes not only to flood and erosion control, but also to ecological and microclimatic resilience in urban watershed systems. Here the lecture focuses more directly on the principles of designing for terrain. The slide highlights contour-aligned development and terracing, check dams and riparian buffers, and the avoidance of construction in floodplains and on steep slopes. The accompanying schematic explains the hydrological processes behind these strategies. Rainfall is first received by the surface, and part of it is lost through evaporation and interception by vegetation. The remaining water becomes overland flow moving downslope. As this runoff passes through vegetated areas and forested buffers, its speed is reduced and infiltration becomes more likely. The infiltration trench shown in this system temporarily stores water, increases ponding depth, and delays downstream discharge. When the storage capacity is exceeded, overtopping occurs and the remaining runoff continues along the drainage pathway. This process illustrates how terrain-sensitive design is not only about form, but also about timing and storage. It helps delay peak runoff, attenuate volumes, enhance subsurface recharge, and reduce the severity of downstream impacts. The broader design lesson is that terrain should be used to structure hydrological performance. When surface form, vegetation, and stormwater infrastructure are integrated, they can function together as a more resilient watershed system. This slide presents the main analytical tools used to support terrain and watershed-sensitive design. The first tool is the Digital Elevation Model, or DEM, which provides a topographic representation of the land surface through elevation data. This elevation information becomes the basis for a range of further analyses. Watershed delineation uses terrain data to define drainage boundaries and identify where water is collected and directed toward an outlet. Slope analysis helps determine the steepness of land surfaces, which is essential for understanding runoff speed, erosion susceptibility, and suitability for different interventions. Flow accumulation mapping identifies where runoff is likely to concentrate along natural drainage paths, helping planners detect critical points of convergence, flood-prone lines, or potential channel formation. Finally, site-specific stormwater modeling is introduced as a way of understanding how precipitation is transformed into runoff under different land use and terrain conditions. Together, these tools allow design and planning decisions to become more evidence-based. Rather than relying on generalized assumptions, designers can analyze how a specific site behaves hydrologically and then propose interventions that are more precisely adapted to local terrain, water movement, and ecological conditions. The first case study demonstrates how watershed and terrain-sensitive planning can be applied in a river corridor project with ecological sensitivity and flood control goals. The Shivas Central Xulmet Corridor project integrates multiple spatial datasets, including elevation, hydrological soil groups, permeability, erosion susceptibility, and land cover. Through this approach, the project identifies hydrologically functional planning units and examines the relationships between slope, runoff potential, and land use within the basin. Although the project is centered on a river corridor, its methodological framework is based on the micro-watershed scale. This is important because the corridor is not treated as an isolated strip of land, but as part of a broader hydrological and ecological network. Design interventions are therefore developed in response to topographic constraints and surface flow regimes. In low-gradient zones, infiltration-supportive land uses are prioritized, while in steeper segments, runoff control strategies become more important. Riparian buffers and interconnected green infrastructure systems enhance hydro-ecological continuity while also helping mitigate localized flood risk and soil erosion. At the same time, these measures support microclimatic stabilization by increasing surface permeability and evapotranspiration. Overall, the case shows how a recreation and flood control project can be grounded in watershed logic rather than in purely linear corridor design. This slide deepens the discussion of the Shivas project by focusing specifically on groundwater recharge zones. These are presented as critical spatial units where urbanization must be managed carefully in order to sustain natural infiltration and subsurface water replenishment. In other words, these landscapes perform an essential hydrological function that should not be compromised by insensitive development. If urbanization reduces soil permeability and interrupts recharge processes, the long-term hydrological balance of the basin may be weakened. Therefore, planning solutions in these areas must protect infiltration capacity while also addressing the increased runoff generated by urbanized zones. Green infrastructure plays a key role here because it can receive, slow, redirect, and partially infiltrate additional surface runoff. This supports both local site performance and the broader basin-wide water balance. The message of this slide is that watershed planning must not only focus on visible flood zones or drainage channels. It must also identify less visible but equally important hydrological spaces such as recharge areas. By protecting these zones and integrating them into planning and design strategies, it becomes possible to support both hydrological resilience and ecological continuity across the basin. The Desire project is used in this lecture to show how watershed-based and terrain-sensitive analysis can support adaptive land management in areas affected by land degradation and desertification. The visual in the slide illustrates hydro-ecological feedback mechanisms linking precipitation, evaporation, infiltration, groundwater recharge, soil water retention, and land use practices. The key point is that these components do not operate independently. They are closely connected to terrain conditions such as slope, soil permeability, and vegetation cover, as well as to human practices such as agriculture, irrigation, grazing, and drainage management. Unsustainable agricultural practices, overgrazing, and inappropriate irrigation techniques can disrupt the balance between infiltration and runoff. As a result, surface flow may increase, groundwater recharge may decline, soils may lose moisture, and erosion may intensify. In this context, hydrological cycle analysis becomes essential because it helps identify how terrain-driven changes in water dynamics contribute to broader land degradation processes. By understanding where runoff increases, where infiltration is limited, and where vegetation or soil conditions are weakened, the project can identify appropriate intervention points. These may include terracing, vegetation restoration, and water harvesting measures. The broader lesson is that terrain-sensitive planning is not only relevant in urban sites, it is also crucial in agricultural and degraded landscapes where water cycle disruption directly affects ecological resilience and land productivity. The San Mateo example is presented as a best practice case showing how watershed-based interventions can be prioritized through a multi-criteria decision framework. In this project, watershed-based green infrastructure and low-impact development interventions are evaluated not only through technical feasibility, but also through hydrogeological, spatial, and socio-ecological criteria. Technical suitability includes issues such as runoff capture capacity, annual runoff depth, location in flood-prone areas, potential contribution to groundwater basins, and the ability to mitigate climate-related increases in runoff associated with transportation surfaces. Hydrogeological conditions are evaluated using hydrologic soil group, groundwater depth, and slope, since these strongly influence infiltration potential and surface flow behavior. Site constraints are also part of the assessment, including available street width, block length, and possible conflicts with major utility infrastructure. Importantly, the framework does not stop at physical criteria. It also includes co-benefit indicators such as vulnerable community indices, vehicle ownership rates, urban heat island intensity, canopy coverage, and pavement condition. This shows that watershed planning can support environmental resilience, social equity, and climatic performance at the same time. The lesson here is that integrated project prioritization helps decision-makers identify interventions that are not only technically sound, but also socially and ecologically meaningful. In the final content slide, the main lessons of the lecture are brought together. First, terrain-sensitive design is emphasized as an approach that reduces risk and increases efficiency by working with slope, elevation, and flow instead of resisting them. This means that design becomes safer and more effective when it follows the logic of terrain and hydrology rather than imposing forms that conflict with them. Second, watershed planning is described as a unifying framework that links nature, infrastructure, and community through the same hydrological system. This is an important conclusion because it reminds us that water is not only a technical issue. It is also a spatial, ecological, and social connector. Third, the lecture highlights the value of integrated tools such as DEM-based analysis, watershed mapping, slope assessment, and runoff modeling. These tools support stronger evidence-based decision-making from site scale to basin scale. Overall, the reflection of this lecture is that resilient planning depends on understanding environmental processes as design foundations. When topography, runoff, infiltration, and drainage systems are treated as core planning elements, it becomes possible to develop interventions that are ecologically grounded, risk-sensitive, and more adaptive in the face of environmental change.